The EPA says that in 2018, plastic was more than 16% of the solid waste from cities that was incinerated, and plastic was 18.5% of waste that went to a landfill. And those numbers keep increasing. Man, let me tell you, the food that comes on the plastic lunch tray is worth the wait. But it did take 4 episodes to get to this point, and all that pollution from extraction to refining and even transportation and manufacturing, all that, it kind of makes me feel a little guilty, okay? And all there is to do now is just dispose of the plastic, right? Hopefully I can just recycle it and pat myself on the back. Unfortunately, if you're thinking like me that recycling is the answer, I got some news for you. Plastic recycling barely works. As always, stick around and I'll explain.
Save our climate, save our earth.
I think one of the most convincing things I can say to let you know that there is a plastic problem is this. We consume plastic on a regular basis. And I've suggested this idea before, but did you know that some studies say we eat almost a credit card's worth of plastic every week? That's not every month or even in a lifetime, as someone might think. And it's just crazy how we eat that much plastic because of tiny, minuscule particles that are in fresh food that's packaged with plastic and even in our water. So let's break down this microplastic thing. But first, we got to talk about macroplastic. When people eat big pieces of plastic or animals, the result is obvious. Choking, because it can block their digestive tract, or it's starvation because the animal or person, whatever, can eat the plastic and their body will think that they're full when really they're not getting any nutrients from this plastic. But the smaller pieces of plastic called microplastics are less understood by most people. Hopefully by now you understand in this podcast series that plastic is made using a lot of toxic chemicals, right? And they can do very bad things when they get into the human body. We've heard from several mom staff about the ways the presence of the petrochemical industry in the community can cause severe health consequences. We've also heard from these communities about how it can feel like an uphill battle to fight against the presence of the petrochemical industry and the onslaught of pollution. But regardless of whether we live near these facilities or not, this is something that we should all be concerned about because, like I said before, we're all consuming some form of microplastic. And there's growing evidence that microplastics are dangerous. They've been found in places where plastic should never be found. Inside of babies and potentially unborn babies, also in human breast milk and even baby poop. Research shows that plastic baby bottles shed microplastics when heated. And if that doesn't alarm you, I don't know what else will. So microplastics should alarm all of us because, again, we're all eating it, including our children. These chemicals that are used to make plastic, and they're toxic, but let me just say them again so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Phthalates, bisphenol A, PFAS, and a class of chemicals called flame retardants, they can do destructive things like cancer, reproductive problems, and countless other worrisome health impacts that would only scare you if I actually detailed them all out right now. We just got to pray that we don't see the consequences of regularly eating them. We can't just say today that I'm never going to eat plastic again when plastic is everywhere, Very few places on the surface of the earth, including the most remote places, the corners of the ocean, very few places have not seen microscopic chemicals from plastic. The reason plastic is everywhere today, we have to say, of course, is partly, even in places it shouldn't be, it's partly because it's really effective at its job. Plastic's chemical components make it a durable and reliable material that can be molded and shaped into different sizes for many different applications. Everything from a school lunch tray to a prosthetic leg or even an IV bag in a hospital. Speaking of hospitals, I'm just going to be honest and admit the following. As a pre-med student, I could easily say it's insincere and ironic for me to be hosting a podcast talking about the health and climate change impacts of petrochemicals and plastics, while at the same time, I want to join an industry that is producing or that is consuming and disposing of so much single-use plastic. I mean, think about all the plastic that's used in hospitals for gloves, syringes, pill bottles, hygiene products, life support, IV bags, like I said before. In fact, the field of healthcare is responsible for millions of tons of plastic consumption and waste every year. And it's been overlooked because of all those uses I was just describing. But in many places, just like in hospitals, plastic is generally cheap to buy, and it's replaced natural, more expensive materials like ivory, tortoise shells, rubber, wood, silk, and paper. Altogether, these things are less durable and less diverse in their applications as plastic. So it's kind of hard for us to just say that, what we have to do right now, today, is completely replace all the plastic consumed in our society, because that's just not something that we can do to support our modern lifestyle. But don't get me wrong, we have to do something about our plastic consumption. Even in healthcare, there's no reason for the excessive use and waste of single-use plastic, like throwaway surgical plastic tools or styrofoam cups. And there's no good reason for us to be producing way more plastic than we actually need ever since the year 2015. And there's definitely no good reason for us to be consuming microplastic. But because facilities continue to produce so much plastic, well, that plastic has to go somewhere. And what we often do is just dispose of it. So let's talk about plastic disposal. When we have plastic waste, whether the plastic has been used or not, sometimes we just burn it up into ashes. Sometimes we recycle it. And other times we just, let the plastic lie on the ground. What you are familiar with, littering, right? Burning it isn't the best idea because there are a lot of toxic chemicals released into the air when we burn plastic. And I've talked about that several times by now. Piling our plastic weight on the ground in a dump site or on the side of the road, like you might see a lot of people do, that's just not good for the environment. Plus, it's not aesthetically pleasing to see, plastic bags just rolling along the sidewalk. And let's think about recycling. That's the solution that you hear most people say to our plastic problem. Recycling. See, recycling plastic is something that we've been told for decades now is something that we have a moral obligation to do. And don't get me wrong, recycling is not a bad thing. It's just that it's terribly inefficient. Beyond throwing our plastic in a little blue or green bin and feeling good about it, what do you really know about the recycling process? We're only recycling a portion of the plastic that we produce. A lot of it is actually not ever going to be recycled. And then once we do recycle it, or let's just step back a little bit. Once our little blue and green bins of recyclable materials, hopefully they're recyclable, they get dumped into a recycling truck, right? Here are the possible outcomes. One possibility is that our plastic waste goes to a facility where it will be packaged to be transported to a dump, either domestically or often overseas, or it will go to an incinerator that, again, might be overseas. Another possibility is that at this facility, wherever it is, the plastic will just be thrown away with the rest of the normal garbage. The other possibility is that the plastic will actually be recycled at the facility, but it's probably unlikely because it's contaminated with other materials like oil, dirt, that just make it kind of annoying and a hassle for the machines to actually process the recyclable materials. So there is no point for us separating it into our blue bin in the first place. Isn't it kind of funny how the bin is often made of plastic too? I just thought that I had to say that. But the truth is that only around 5% of the plastic that we attempt to recycle actually ever gets recycled. 5%. That's wild. Imagine for every 100 pieces of plastic, every 100 water bottles that you think you've done good and thrown away in the bin, only 5 are actually getting recycled. Whoa. The rest goes to a landfill or an incinerator. And even when plastic is recycled, there is a problem. You see, the actual recycling process requires us heating up the plastic to dangerously high temperatures just so we can get the plastic or recover some of the plastic materials that we really want, the ethylene and propylene, which are the basic chemical structures that we're looking to make all types of plastic, right? First of all, we're not going to recover 100% of the ethylene and propylene that was originally used to make the plastic. And even so, the process of burning this plastic is going to release toxic chemicals because the toxic chemicals were in the plastic when it was first made. And so to get it back to its ethylene and propylene forms, we have to release a lot of toxic chemicals into the air. So recycling isn't as simple, and it's definitely not as harmless as we think. So in the show notes, I actually, I'm going to put some resources so everybody can look at what plastics actually get recycled at a high rate. And so the key takeaway from all this is that recycling is something that can never be a complete solution to our plastic problem. Recycling is only a partial solution, even though we seem to exalt it as the optimal decision for all our plastic waste in our society. And now that I've said that, I'm hoping you're starting to wonder. So if plastic recycling is so inefficient, why is this the first time I'm ever hearing about this nuance about recycling? The good news is we have a petrochemicals and plastic expert here at Mom's Clean Air Force to talk about this.
Here is an eye-opening conversation I had with Mom's Clean Air Force Senior Petrochemical Analyst Cynthia Palmer. Why do we use so much plastic given that there are so many safety concerns attached to producing, using, or disposing of it?
It's a great question. First of all, most people have no idea what plastic really is. The fact that it's made by combining fossil gas, petroleum, or coal with toxic chemicals such as PFAS, phthalates, and heavy metals. The fact that a lot of the chemicals leach out of the plastic, exposing everyone from the babies in the neonatal intensive care units to the families heating up a frozen lasagna for dinner. The fact that the extraction and processing of the feedstocks releases hazardous air pollutants such as benzene, formaldehyde, and ethylene oxide, putting people at high risk of cancers, respiratory ailments, reproductive disorders, and other ill effects. The fact that petrochemicals are flammable and explosive, so their transport in pipelines, bomb trucks, and bomb trains endangers unsuspecting communities across the country. The fact that plastics keep emitting greenhouse gases forever, even once they become tiny microplastic particles polluting our soils and our waterways. Another reason we keep using plastic is that often we have no choice as individuals. Virtually everything is made of plastic these days, and so much of it is single use, from supermarket and fast food meals to the styrofoam trays still used in many schools to the throwaway single-use blood pressure cuffs in hospitals. A third reason we use so much plastic is that plastic is often the cheapest option. But is it really cheap? Not at all. It's simply that the petrochemical industry does not pay the cost, or as an economist would say, they externalize the cost. The companies get away with releasing vast amounts of carcinogens in communities at every step of the supply chain, and they evade responsibility for disposal of plastics, which last forever. There is no safe way to get rid of plastic.
How has the petrochemical industry been deceptive about recycling?
Big plastic spends hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising each year. They can afford to hire the top marketing firms. The petrochemical sector is part of the fossil fuel industry, which has been making $2.8 billion globally per day for the past 50 years. There are parallels with the tobacco industry, failing to disclose basic information on the toxic chemicals, claiming confidentiality and trade secrets at every step of the way, questioning the science about harmful effects, publicly claiming to support health and environmental protection, while behind the scenes being very much aware of the dangers they are causing and fighting against any restrictions.
How has the petrochemical industry been deceptive about recycling?
Plastic recycling is hardly a solution to the plastic crisis, but rather a harmful but better than nothing end-of-pipe approach for a small subset of plastic waste. Recycling has significant downsides. Only a small subset of plastic can actually be recycled, and then only once or twice, since the quality declines. Unlike, say, glass or metal, which can be recycled over and over without reducing quality. Also, things like potato chip bags or candy wrappers may look relatively simple, but actually they incorporate multiple plastic polymers, often with a layer of metal or paper as well. Plastics are made from various combinations of 13,000 different chemicals, and it's impossible to do the separation that would be needed for recycling. Another problem is that plastics recycling releases microplastics. A recent study examined the wastewater effluent from a plastics recycling facility before and after the installation of cutting-edge filtration equipment. And even with the high-tech filtering, the scientists calculated that the total discharge amounted to up to 75 billion particles per cubic meter of wastewater from the recycling facility. This water gets released into the environment, including into the groundwater, drinking water, and water used to irrigate crops. The researchers also found high concentrations of airborne plastic particles in the recycling facility, putting workers' health at risk. And as for consumers, recycled plastics raise red flags for end users as well. Studies are finding elevated concentrations of toxic chemicals in recycled plastic children's toys, water bottles, and food containers. Things like PFAS, phthalates, flame retardants, bisphenol A, UV stabilizers, and other chemicals.
What is this new thing called advanced recycling?
So-called advanced recycling is a heavily polluting, inefficient, energy-intensive incineration technology. The plastics industry is aggressively promoting this false recycling. They call it advanced recycling or chemical recycling or molecular recycling. And they claim that it is a solution to the plastic waste crisis. But really, these are waste incinerators that pollute surrounding communities with toxic emissions such as dioxins, benzene, formaldehyde, and heavy metals. By rebranding these plastics burning technologies as recycling, the facilities are able to sidestep the pollution controls and air monitoring of the Clean Air Act.
What should we do with all the plastic that we've already made then? Is our only answer to hope that we can recycle better?
For most plastic waste, aside from the number 1 and number 2 bottles that can be recycled, municipal waste landfilling may be the best option for now. landfilling buys us time to transition to more sustainable materials, products, and processes. Landfills are not without problems, and it is critical that these facilities adhere to strict procedures to prevent air and water contamination and fire hazards. The quantities of waste that end up in landfills can be reduced dramatically by shifting away from our single-use, single-stream lifestyle. And when landfills reach their capacity, waste mountains can be covered with clay and a plastic shield, plus several feet of soils and plants, and these facilities can be transformed into carefully monitored parks. While there is no good way to dispose of waste plastic, there are proven solutions to the plastic crisis, and all require leadership to reduce the reliance on plastic. Currently, the world is on course to triple production of plastics. So as a first step, we are urging the Biden administration to stop the build-out of new plastics production facilities. There are all sorts of ways to reduce demand for plastics. Our northern neighbors in Canada have banned many types of single-use plastics, and we could do the same. Even 5 or 10 cents fees on plastic bags and bottle deposit systems can be effective in raising awareness and reducing reliance on single-use plastics.
Lastly, how have petrochemical facilities been able to justify their actions in poorer communities?
There is no way to justify the actions of the petrochemical companies. Dow, DuPont, Formosa, BASF, Westlake, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and the other fossil fuel petrochemical companies target some of the most overburdened and underserved communities in America. Many of these areas are former slave plantations. The companies contribute money to politicians and they make deals. They greenwash their operations with claims about safety and about economic development, jobs, and prosperity, even though these things do not materialize for local communities. Rather, the Black, brown, indigenous, and low-income communities that host plastics-making facilities face heavy concentrations of round-the-clock toxic air pollution, as well as the daily risk of leaks, explosions, fires, and other catastrophic events. Researchers are finding that these communities actually suffer economically as well when they are forced to host petrochemical facilities. And meanwhile, the stench, noise, and eyesore dramatically reduce quality of life as well as property values. The way our governments turn a blind eye to these communities and even subsidize the continued petrochemical industry build-out is environmental injustice at its worst.
Okay, that's a whole lot to digest from one episode. So at this point, I'm going to give you conversation starters, because imagine trying to talk to somebody about all that information. It's like nearly impossible. But here are some conversation starters to cover some of that information. My first question is, do you know how recycling actually works? Second one you could ask somebody is, do you know that all plastic can't be recycled? Somewhere globally, the percentage is 9%. Did you know that we eat plastic a credit card's worth every week without knowing? That's definitely going to start a conversation. I mean, like, we like to think that we're in charge of our decisions, even though we're really not for a lot of them. And so to really throw that in somebody can totally cause some upheaval in their day. And while it's not on us, I just want to say this after giving you these conversation starters. While it's not on us as individuals to tackle the gravity of the plastics problem, it is empowering to find alternatives, right? That don't further line the pockets of fossil fuel companies. So, one more conversation starter for this episode is: are there any plastic replacements that we can make in our lives? And hopefully, we can share a lot of resources about that in the show notes. So, look for that as well. And I've just got to say, that interview with Cynthia was so frustrating because as I sat there and heard all of this from her, I just realized that we've been lied to our whole lives about plastic. It's been a well-funded lie that recycling plastic and plastic is something that we can easily do away with by, doing the right thing, throwing plastic in a bin, and being sure that we're doing the right thing for the planet and for people. It's been a well-funded lie supported by rich companies that value money and continued profits over people and the planet. And all this time, I had felt so guilty for my use of plastic. But I will say it does make me feel a little bit better to know that, it's not completely my fault that I use so much plastic. I mean, it's been pushed on me by industry when I go to the grocery store, for example. Anyways, I hope you're feeling, though, definitely some sense of frustration. With me, I'm frustrated too. It's definitely going to get you angry to hear about all this pollution and how you think you're doing the right thing, but really you're just enabling more poison to be put into our communities. I mean, it's a little overwhelming if you just are hearing all of this for the first time. Some people even depressing. But what I do know is that with any work related to public health and environmental activism in general, you need a certain amount of radical optimism. I feel like I say that term a lot to keep fighting, because if we convince ourselves to give into despair, we let the plastics industry win, and we're not gonna do that. So now that you've listened to this episode, I want you to talk about some action steps that maybe you and your family or whoever you're going to share this with can do. Because we can't just, again, give you all this heavy content and you don't have anything to do with it. So after every episode, I've been giving action steps, level 1, level 2, level 3. And now we're at episode 4. So level 4 action item. I want to see if you can support alternatives to plastic as much as possible when you go buying stuff. If I put in the show notes some resources, I hope you can look at them and start thinking about how you can reduce your plastic consumption. An example of an easy switch you can do, Cynthia actually introduced this to me as an idea, is taking plastic bottles that we often use for like shampoo and replacing that with just like a bar of shampoo. It doesn't come in a plastic bottle that you're gonna have to eventually, after it's done, throw it in a recycling bin and hope that it gets recycled. So that was level 4. Think about alternatives of action items. And quick recap of levels 3 through 1. Episode 3, I said, come to a Mom's Clean Air Force event near you or a virtual event if that's what you can do. Level 2, sign up to get involved with Mom's Clean Air Force. Join a community of over 1.5 million members, moms, dads, caregivers who are determined to fight against this plastics pollution problem. And level 1, there will be resources that will connect you to several petitions you can sign on the Moms Clean Air Force webpage for this podcast. And I hope you let the Environmental Protection Agency know that you're concerned about all these toxic chemicals that they're putting in our plastic that we eventually consume. Thank you for listening to this episode. It's been a heck of a journey. We have one more episode together, and the goal is to, get you out there and ready to contribute in this fight against plastic. We are going to discuss the mental health issues of doing this, though, because it can quickly become overwhelming for people. And yeah, I realize that this episode might have not been super helpful for feelings of powerlessness, but you needed to know the truth. Okay, so stick around because I can't leave you feeling like this. We have some work to do.